Hello, I'm Alex. Today, I'm sharing with you a story that will challenge what you believe about family, redemption, and the true meaning of legacy. At its heart, this is not just a tale of wealth and betrayal, it is a powerful journey of forgiveness, second chances, and the strength it takes to rebuild. Through heartbreak and loss, the Whitmore family learns that legacy is not measured in money, but in love, integrity, and the courage to make things right. This story will remind you that forgiveness does not erase the past, but it allows us to shape the future. No matter how broken a family may seem, if there is love, there is hope. True wealth is not in what we own, but in the love we give, the trust we earn, and the forgiveness we offer. In the heart of Greenwich, Connecticut, the Whitmore estate stood as a testament to wealth, legacy, and generations of old money influence. The grand colonial home, with its towering white pillars and meticulously manicured gardens, was more than just a residence, it was an institution. For over 3 decades, Preston and Eleanor Whitmore had presided over their world with quiet authority, their success built upon Whitmore Properties, a real estate empire that spanned the Northeast. Their name was synonymous with power, their reputation unshakable. At least, that was what they believed. Their eldest daughter, Charlotte Whitmore Hale, had never fit the mold of a traditional heiress. At 35, she had long abandoned the expectations placed upon her, choosing a path of independence rather than inheriting the family business. Instead, she carved out a career in biomedical research, earning the respect of her peers while building a stable, fulfilling life with her husband, David Hale, a self-made entrepreneur in the tech industry. Their marriage was built on mutual respect, love, and a shared vision of success on their own terms. Together, they had created a home not defined by status, but by warmth, a home centered around their 8-year-old adopted daughter, Sophie. With her thoughtful nature and deep brown eyes, Sophie had a quiet way of making people feel seen. Each afternoon, after school, she would stop by her grandparents' estate, carefully watering the garden's roses, a silent gesture of affection that went unnoticed by the people inside. Neighbors often smiled at the sight, mistaking it for a cherished family tradition. They did not realize that for Sophie, tending to the flowers was more than just an after-school ritual, it was a quiet plea for recognition, for belonging. Inside the estate, however, discussions revolved around succession, wealth preservation, and appearances, not love. Preston and Eleanor had placed their trust in their younger daughter, Victoria, a woman as sharp as she was ambitious. Unlike Charlotte, Victoria had embraced her role within the family empire, leaving behind a career in corporate law to take over Whitmore Properties' financial division. Though her recent divorce and excessive spending raised whispers, Preston and Eleanor saw her as the rightful heir. She was the one who carried their legacy forward. She was the future. Charlotte had long since stopped hoping for their approval. She had built her own life, free from their expectations. But as Christmas approached, she could not help but wonder, was there still a place for her daughter in this family? Would love ever outweigh legacy? She did not know it yet, but this year, the answer would be written in the snow, in the silence, and in the fractures of a family on the brink of collapse. The Whitmore estate was breathtaking that night, glowing under the soft shimmer of Christmas lights. The grand colonial home, standing like a monument to prestige, was dressed in exquisite holiday decor, a towering Christmas tree adorned with crystal ornaments, silver-trimmed garlands cascading down the banisters, and a dining table set with fine china under the flickering glow of a crystal chandelier. The scent of roasted duck and fresh-baked pastries filled the air, a carefully curated image of perfection. But beneath the surface, the cracks in the Whitmore family ran deep. Charlotte stepped into the foyer with David by her side, his steady presence grounding her in a way that reminded her why she had walked away from this world. Sophie clutched a small gift bag, filled with freshly baked cookies she had made with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Turner. Charlotte had watched her daughter carefully fold each one, tying the bag with a ribbon and writing, in her careful handwriting, "For Grandma and Grandpa. Love, Sophie." As they walked into the grand sitting room, laughter filled the air. Across the room, Victoria stood in a sleek designer dress, chatting effortlessly with distant relatives, her 7-year-old son, Oliver, already tearing into the extravagant gifts he had received, a brand new gaming console, designer clothes, a sleek mini drone. Each unwrapped present was met with cheers and admiration. Sophie watched with quiet anticipation. She had never expected gifts like that, but she had imagined something small, something that told her she mattered. The gift exchange began. One by one, family members unwrapped their presents, exclaiming in delight at fine jewelry, luxury accessories, and high-end electronics. Oliver's name was called repeatedly, his stack of gifts growing higher by the minute. But as the last beautifully wrapped box was opened, Sophie's name was never spoken. Charlotte's fingers curled into fists. She glanced at David, who had already sensed the shift in the room. The laughter had softened. The realization had sunk in. Sophie blinked, her deep brown eyes searching the room. Slowly, she turned to Eleanor, her voice small but steady. "Grandma," she whispered. "Did I do something wrong?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Eleanor lifted her teacup, pausing for only a fraction of a second before speaking. "Christmas gifts are for family, dear," she said with a polished, practiced smile. "And Oliver is our grandson." The words, though spoken softly, cut like a knife. Sophie stiffened. Her small fingers clutched the gift bag still resting in her lap. She was only 8, but she understood. She was not family. Charlotte inhaled sharply, her breath catching in her throat. David, who had always been the calm one, the level-headed one, tightened his jaw. Sophie turned to Victoria, who simply took a slow sip of wine, an unreadable expression on her face. Oliver, oblivious, continued playing with his new gaming console. Charlotte rose slowly from her chair. Her voice was steady, but underneath it was a steel edge no one had ever dared challenge. "That is the last time you will ever hurt my daughter." Eleanor's composure faltered for the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her eyes. Preston shifted uncomfortably, but he said nothing. David stood as well, his presence a silent show of solidarity. He turned to Eleanor, his tone quiet but firm. "We will not stay where our daughter is not welcome." For a moment, it seemed as if Eleanor might protest, but Preston lifted a hand, stopping her. His face, usually unreadable, was etched with something close to regret. But it was too late. Charlotte reached for Sophie's hand, feeling her daughter's small fingers tremble in hers. Without another word, they turned toward the door. As they walked across the grand hallway, Sophie hesitated. She looked down at the small bag of cookies she had made with so much care, her last gift of love, still clutched in her tiny hands. Then, with a deep breath, she set the bag gently on the table, untouched. They left without looking back. Outside, the cold winter air bit at Charlotte's skin, but she barely felt it. Snow had begun to fall, dusting the world in quiet white. David opened the car door for Sophie, who climbed into the back seat, still silent. As Charlotte settled into the passenger seat, she stole a glance at her daughter through the rearview mirror. Sophie held the Christmas card she had written for her grandparents. Her small fingers traced over the words. "To Grandma and Grandpa, with love." David started the engine. The car's headlights sliced through the falling snow, illuminating the grand estate behind them, its glowing windows, its warm lights, its hollow heart. Charlotte took a deep breath, then reached for David's hand. "This is the last time," she murmured. And as they drove away, leaving the weight of the Whitmore name behind them, she knew that this Christmas had marked the end of an era, and the beginning of something new. The morning after Christmas was unusually quiet in the Hale household. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, but Charlotte sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the untouched cup in front of her. Across from her, David scrolled through emails, though his attention drifted toward his wife. Neither had spoken much since the night before. Upstairs, Sophie was still asleep, emotionally drained from the realization that the family she had loved so deeply had never truly considered her their own. Charlotte exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the ceramic mug. "I am done," she finally murmured. David set his phone down. "No more financial support. No more pretending. No more giving them anything they do not deserve," she continued, her voice steady. David studied her for a long moment before nodding. "You do not have to convince me," he said. Charlotte had spent years covering for her parents, quietly paying for their mounting expenses, ensuring the estate remained pristine, even when she no longer called it home. It had been a duty, a reluctant obligation, one she had carried even when they had made it clear she was an outsider. But last night had severed that final thread. She picked up her phone and dialed Thomas Grayson, her family's longtime accountant, who had managed the financial dealings of Whitmore properties for over 2 decades. He picked up after the second ring, his voice calm yet strangely measured. "Charlotte," he greeted her. "I have been meaning to reach out." Charlotte frowned. "About what?" There was a pause, then a heavy sigh. "There are irregularities in the estate's financial records," Thomas said. "Massive ones. The numbers do not add up, and the expenses," he hesitated before continuing, "someone has been bleeding the company dry." Charlotte sat up straighter. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 3 years. Maybe longer." A chill ran through her. Her father was meticulous when it came to business. There was no way he would have overlooked something like this, unless someone had made sure he never saw it. Charlotte's voice hardened. "Send me everything you have. Every suspicious transaction. Every contract. I want to see it all." That afternoon, as the winter sun hung low over Greenwich, Charlotte drove toward the Whitmore estate for the first time since Christmas Eve. The grand home, once an untouchable monument of power, now seemed smaller, the illusion of prestige fading. She parked but did not step out immediately. Through the large windows, she could see her father sitting in his study, his head bowed over a stack of papers. The weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the heavy oak door. It was Eleanor who answered. Her mother looked surprised but quickly masked it, smoothing her cashmere sweater as if Charlotte's presence was an inconvenience rather than a concern. "Charlotte," Eleanor said smoothly. "I did not expect." "I need to speak to Dad," Charlotte interrupted, her tone sharper than she intended. Eleanor hesitated before stepping aside. Charlotte walked past her and headed straight for the study. Preston looked up as she entered. For a brief moment, there was something vulnerable in his gaze, something she had never seen before. Charlotte set a thick folder of printed documents on his desk. "Dad," she said quietly, "we have a problem." Preston frowned as he opened the folder. His eyes scanned the pages, his expression darkening with each passing second. Wire transfers to unknown accounts. Inflated invoices for services never rendered. Properties listed as assets that had already been sold. And at the center of it all, one name appeared over and over again. Victoria Whitmore. His youngest daughter. His heir. Silence filled the room except for the crackling fireplace. Preston finally set the papers down, rubbing a hand over his face. "How bad is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "At least 5 million, Charlotte said. That is what I have been able to track so far. It could be worse." Preston leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping absently against the desk, a man coming to terms with a truth he could no longer deny. Charlotte took a slow breath before delivering the final blow. "We have to report this. If we do not, the authorities will come. And when they do, we better not be on the wrong side of it." Preston swallowed hard, his face pale. Charlotte had expected resistance. Denial. Some desperate attempt to protect Victoria, as they always had. But instead, her father nodded. "Do it," he said. For the first time in her life, her father had chosen to listen to her. Charlotte exhaled, the weight in her chest loosening slightly. But she knew this was only the beginning. Whitmore properties would be investigated. Their father's once pristine reputation would be dragged through the mud. And Victoria, wherever she was, would not go down without a fight. As Charlotte left the estate, she felt the gravity of the moment settle over her. She was no longer just the daughter who had been cast aside. She was the one who had uncovered the truth. The one who would no longer be ignored. And for the first time, she felt free. The morning headlines hit Greenwich like a thunderstorm. Whitmore properties under investigation for financial fraud. The black and white photograph of Preston Whitmore stepping out of his office, his face drawn and weary, was plastered across every business section. The once mighty real estate empire that had been a cornerstone of old money Connecticut was now crumbling under the weight of deception. At the Hale residence, Charlotte stood by the kitchen counter, the newspaper trembling in her hands. She had expected this moment, but seeing her father's name in ink still made her chest tighten. Across the room, David watched her, silent but steady. "It has begun," he said quietly. Charlotte nodded. And it was only going to get worse. The details of the investigation were damning. Millions siphoned away, falsified reports, secret offshore accounts, all traced back to Victoria. For years, she had manipulated the company's finances, exploiting their parents' blind faith and Preston's old-fashioned trust in paper records over digital security. At the Whitmore estate, the usually pristine halls were eerily quiet. The household staff had vanished, their wages unpaid as the company's assets were frozen. Bills piled up. Creditors called relentlessly. Margaret Whitmore sat in the formal sitting room, staring at the empty fireplace, as if waiting for the warmth of the past to return. Across from her, Preston was hunched over financial documents, his hands shaking slightly. "She did this," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Margaret's fingers trembled as she clutched a porcelain teacup. "We do not know that for certain." "Do not," Preston snapped, his voice sharp. "Do not defend her." The weight of those words settled between them. That afternoon, Charlotte arrived at the estate, stepping into a house that no longer carried the effortless elegance it once had. The grand illusion was fading. Preston barely looked up as she entered his study. "What happens next?" she asked. He let out a long, measured breath. "Liquidation. Asset seizures. We are looking at 10, maybe 15 million in liabilities. The house will have to go." For the first time, Charlotte saw her father not as the powerful businessman she had spent her childhood trying to impress, but as an aging man watching his empire fall apart. Margaret entered, her carefully polished veneer beginning to crack. "What about Victoria? Have they found her?" Charlotte shook her head. "Not yet. But they will. And when they do, this will not be something we can sweep under the rug." Margaret turned away, pressing a hand to her temple. She had spent a lifetime believing that wealth could shield them from consequences. But now, the truth was undeniable. By late evening, a call came through. David answered, his face darkening as he listened. When he hung up, he met Charlotte's gaze. "They found her," he said. "She was trying to flee the country through JFK. The police have her in custody." Margaret gasped, covering her mouth with trembling fingers. Preston closed his eyes, exhaling deeply, as if surrendering to the inevitable. Charlotte, however, simply exhaled. "Then it is over." But deep down, she knew better. This was just the beginning of a different kind of reckoning. The following morning, news of Victoria's arrest dominated every media outlet. Whitmore heiress arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scandal. The once polished socialite was now seen in handcuffs, escorted by federal agents through the airport terminal. The woman who had spent her life in designer clothes now stood with her head bowed, stripped of the power she once wielded so effortlessly. At the Whitmore estate, Preston sat in silence, staring at the television screen as the footage looped on every channel. The world he had built was gone. Margaret, pale and shaken, whispered, "She is my daughter." Charlotte, standing near the window, watching the snow begin to fall, responded softly, "She made her choices." Later that night, Charlotte sat in her home office, sifting through the case files. The evidence against Victoria was overwhelming. She had manipulated contracts, redirected corporate funds into personal accounts, and forged signatures. For years, Victoria had believed herself untouchable. Now, she was facing up to 15 years in prison. A soft knock at the door pulled Charlotte from her thoughts. Sophie stood there, clutching a photo album. "Mom?" she asked hesitantly. Charlotte offered a small smile. "Yes, sweetheart." Sophie climbed onto her lap, flipping through the pages. Images of Christmases past. Smiling faces. A world that no longer existed. After a moment, Sophie spoke. "Can I still see Oliver?" she asked softly. Charlotte felt her throat tighten. Oliver. Victoria's son. An innocent child caught in the wreckage. "I do not know, honey," she admitted. "But if he wants to see you, we will make it happen." Sophie nodded, as if accepting that answer. Then she pointed to a photo, last Christmas, before everything had shattered. "Grandpa looks sad," she observed. Charlotte glanced at the image. Preston Whitmore, standing near the grand Christmas tree, a glass of bourbon in hand, his gaze distant. "He is," she murmured. "But maybe that will change." The fall of the Whitmore empire had been swift, brutal, and deeply personal. But amidst the wreckage, Charlotte saw something else, the possibility of rebuilding. Of redefining what family truly meant. For the first time, it was not about money, not about legacy, not about keeping up appearances. It was about healing. And that, she thought, was worth fighting for. Spring had arrived in Greenwich, yet the Whitmore estate remained frozen in time, its once imposing grandeur now diminished. The wrought iron gates, which had once symbolized exclusivity and prestige, now stood slightly ajar, revealing an overgrown garden, neglected and forgotten. Without the usual fleet of landscapers and caretakers, the estate had lost its polished perfection, much like the family it had housed for decades. At Gracewood Cottage, where Charlotte, David, and Sophie had found refuge in the wake of their departure from the Whitmore family, life had settled into a quiet rhythm. The home, though modest compared to the grand estate, had become a place of warmth, laughter, and renewal. One April afternoon, Charlotte found Sophie kneeling in the garden, carefully tending to a bed of newly planted roses. Her small fingers brushed over the delicate petals, her expression thoughtful. Charlotte crouched beside her. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Sophie hesitated before looking up. "Do you think Grandpa and Grandma miss me?" Charlotte inhaled, her chest tightening at the innocence of the question. She had spent months untangling herself from the pain her parents had caused, from the rejection that had left Sophie heartbroken. And yet, children had a way of seeing through the bitterness, of searching for light in the places adults had long since abandoned. "I do not know," Charlotte admitted honestly. "But I think, maybe they do." Sophie nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. "Can we visit them?" Charlotte froze. She had convinced herself that she had moved on, that there was nothing left to salvage between her and her parents. But here was Sophie, standing at the intersection of past and future, offering a choice. 1 week later, on an unseasonably warm afternoon, Charlotte found herself standing outside the Whitmore estate once again. David was beside her, his presence grounding. Sophie, clutching a handmade photo album, took a deep breath before knocking on the door. A long silence stretched before the door creaked open. It was Margaret who stood in the entryway. Gone was the meticulously curated elegance. Her once impeccable posture had softened, her perfectly coiffed hair now streaked with silver strands left untamed. She looked smaller somehow, the weight of the past months carved into the lines of her face. Behind her, Preston sat in his usual chair by the window, staring out at the neglected garden where Sophie had once played. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came out. Then, Sophie broke the silence. "I made this for you," she said, holding out the photo album with both hands. Margaret hesitated before accepting it, her fingers trembling. She carefully flipped through the pages, her breath catching as she saw the moments captured within: Sophie baking cookies, tending to flowers, kneeling in prayer at St. Mary's Church. Simple things. Beautiful things. Things she had overlooked for far too long. Preston turned, his weary gaze landing on his granddaughter. "You still think about us?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Sophie nodded. "I pray for you every Sunday." Margaret let out a quiet sob, clutching the album to her chest. Charlotte, who had braced herself for confrontation, found herself witnessing something entirely unexpected: not an argument, not an excuse, just raw, unfiltered grief. Margaret turned to her daughter, her voice barely above a whisper. "We made a terrible mistake." The words hung in the air. Preston, the once proud patriarch, looked at Charlotte not as a disappointment, but as the daughter he had wronged. Charlotte swallowed hard. This was the apology she had once longed for. And yet, standing here now, she realized, it was not what truly mattered. What mattered was the small girl standing between them, offering them a second chance. Sophie, despite everything, had chosen love. After a long pause, Charlotte finally spoke. "Let's sit down," she said. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Over the following weeks, the process of rebuilding began, slowly, carefully, without expectation. Preston and Margaret, now living in a modest townhouse after selling the estate, started visiting Gracewood Cottage. The conversations were hesitant at first, tiptoeing around old wounds. But Sophie, in her quiet way, bridged the gap. She asked Preston to help her plant new flowers in the garden. She asked Margaret to teach her how to sew. And little by little, the walls began to crumble. One afternoon, as Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her hands dusted with flour, she looked at Charlotte. "I have spent my whole life measuring worth in the wrong things," she admitted. Charlotte studied her mother's face, seeing something new in her, a woman, not just an institution. "I know," she said simply. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Charlotte sat beside her father on the back porch. They had not spoken much, but tonight, Preston broke the silence. "I spent years building a legacy," he murmured, staring out at the freshly planted roses. "And I thought that meant money, influence, control." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "But I was wrong." Charlotte waited. Preston let out a slow breath. "I failed you. I failed all of us." A lump formed in Charlotte's throat. "It is not too late," she said. Preston nodded slowly, as if understanding for the first time. Inside, Margaret and Sophie were laughing over a tray of slightly burnt cookies. David poured 2 glasses of wine, offering one to Charlotte with a knowing smile. This was not the life the Whitmores had once envisioned. But in its own way, it was something greater. It was a family, one rebuilt not from expectations, but from love. And for the first time in a long while, Charlotte felt at peace. Christmas arrived once more, but this year, it looked nothing like the past. There were no lavish parties, no glittering crystal ornaments imported from Europe, no towering banquet tables lined with gourmet dishes prepared by a hired staff. The Whitmore estate was no longer theirs, and the remnants of its grandeur belonged to history. Instead, in the warm glow of Gracewood Cottage, the soft flicker of candlelight reflected off handmade ornaments, each carefully crafted by Sophie's small hands. The scent of freshly baked apple pie drifted from the kitchen, where Margaret and Charlotte stood side by side, rolling out dough. At the dining table, Preston sat across from David, reviewing a series of financial reports. Though Whitmore Properties had collapsed, a new vision was taking shape. "We have finalized the debt repayment plan," Preston murmured, tapping a page with his pen. His voice, once laced with unshakable authority, now carried something different: humility. "It will take years, but it is possible." Charlotte nodded. A year ago, she would never have imagined sitting at the same table as her father, discussing the future of a company she had once wanted no part in. But things had changed. "What about the foundation?" she asked. Preston exhaled. "I want to move forward with it. A portion of any future profits will go towards supporting adoption services. It is the least we can do." Margaret placed a plate of warm cookies on the table, listening quietly. "We should have done something like this a long time ago," she admitted. Charlotte swallowed the lump in her throat. Her parents, once proud, untouchable figures of wealth and control, had finally come to understand that legacy was not built in money, but in the lives they touched. Sophie skipped into the room, carrying a small stack of Christmas cards. "I made one for Aunt Victoria too," she said, handing them out. A hush fell over the room. No one had spoken about Victoria in months. She was serving her sentence now, far from the life she had once known. Charlotte had not visited her, nor had she planned to. But as she looked at the small, handwritten card in Sophie's hands, she saw something pure, something unburdened by anger. "May I see it?" Margaret asked softly. Sophie handed it over. Inside, in her neat, careful handwriting, the words were simple yet powerful. "I hope you are okay. I hope you are not lonely. Merry Christmas." Margaret pressed her lips together, her hands trembling slightly. The room remained silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. Then, Preston cleared his throat. "Perhaps, it is time to reach out." Charlotte met David's gaze, his quiet nod a reminder that the past did not have to define the future. "Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But one day." As the evening stretched on, laughter filled the cottage. Margaret, in an old habit she had never quite shaken, placed an extra plate at the table. "Just in case," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and steady, as if blanketing the past and making way for something new. The rise and fall of the Whitmore family is more than a cautionary tale of wealth and deception, it is a profound reflection on the choices that shape our lives and the relationships that define us. In a world that glorifies status and power, their journey reminds us that the true measure of success is not in what we own, but in the love we cultivate, the trust we uphold, and the forgiveness we are brave enough to offer. For years, Preston Whitmore believed that wealth was the key to security, that legacy was built on power and inheritance. Yet, when his empire crumbled, he came to understand a deeper truth: legacy is not measured in dollars, but in the love and integrity we pass down. His transformation serves as a lesson that the greatest investment one can make is in people, not possessions. Charlotte's journey reveals that forgiveness is not about erasing the past, but about refusing to let it control the future. She had every reason to sever ties, to let bitterness consume her. Yet, when faced with the opportunity to rebuild, she chose healing over hatred. Her strength lies not in forgetting the pain, but in rising above it. At the heart of the story is Sophie, a child who, in her quiet innocence, sees what adults so often forget. Her simple gestures, watering the flowers, baking cookies, writing a Christmas card, are small, yet powerful acts of love. She reminds us that family is not about perfection, but presence, that love is not something to be earned, but something to be given freely. And then, there is Victoria, a stark reminder that greed, deception, and entitlement will always lead to ruin. She believed she could manipulate her way to security, that she was untouchable. But no amount of wealth can protect someone from the consequences of their own choices. Her fall is proof that integrity is the only foundation strong enough to withstand the test of time. Yet, in the end, the Whitmore family's story is not one of destruction, but of redemption. Healing was not easy, nor was it instant, but it was possible. Through humility, accountability, and love, they began to rebuild, not the empire they once cherished, but something far greater, a family that was finally whole. In today's world, where so many chase after money, recognition, and status, this story stands as a reminder that the greatest riches are found not in wealth, but in the love we nurture, the trust we protect, and the forgiveness we dare to give.